Hi, during this lecture we are going to go over part 1 of the bone tissue chapter. During this chapter we are going to go over the study of bone, which is called osteology, the osseous tissue, the structure of bone tissue, mineralization and calcification, and the study of the skeletal system, which includes bone, the cartilage, and the ligaments associated with it. Now, the skeletal system provides a strong, flexible network for the body and a framework for the muscular system, which is going to be our next unit. The skeletal system has several functions. The most obvious function of the skeletal system is to provide structural framework and a point of attachment for the muscular system. It also provides protection. One of the most important organs of the human body, which is the brain, is housed within a bony, hollow, skeletal or bony box, which is the skull. The spinal cord is protected within the vertebrae, as well as the internal organs are protected within the rib cage, the pelvis. It helps with movements in conjunction with our muscles. It is a reservoir for calcium and phosphate ions within the body. It is an organ of hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the word for production of red blood cells. So it helps, the red blood cells help with oxygen and carbon dioxide homeostasis. They provide oxygen to different tissues of the body and remove carbon dioxide. They also help with white blood cell formation. And this occurs within the red bone marrow, which is the hollow part of bones. And they also help with triglyceride or fat storage, which occurs in the yellow bone marrow. So the yellow bone marrow and the red bone marrow are parts of the bone which are housed within the hollow parts of the bone, which we're going to talk about a little bit later within this lecture. Now, bone is a connective tissue, a solid connective tissue. Now, as with any connective tissue, there is a ground substance. The difference between loose connective tissue and bone connective tissue is that the matrix or the ground substance in bone is hardened or calcified by minerals such as calcium phosphate. It does interact physiologically with all other organ systems, so it is a dynamic connective tissue, and it is highly vascularized and permeated with nerves. So it does receive afferent and efferent signals, and it does continually remodels itself. So an individual bone, for example, the femur or the hip bone, the long bone, the thigh bone, consists of bone tissue, bone marrow, blood vessels, cartilage, which is also connective tissue, and periosteum, which is also a type of cartilage tissue. Now, based on its density, there are two types of bone. One, the more dense type of bone is compact bone. Now, compact bone is more densely formed, and hence is more stronger. It has fewer spaces because it's more tightly packed. And it forms the diaphyses. A little bit later I'm going to talk about what diaphyses is. So diaphyses is the external layer of all bones. So the external layer of all bones is made up of compact or the denser type of bone. The less dense type of bone is called spongy bone. Now, it's called spongy bone because it looks like a sponge. It looks more porous. It's lesser organized and hence more lightweight because of its porosity. And the porous part of this is called the bone marrow. It forms the epiphysis, which I'm also going to talk about in the next few slides, and the internal cavity. So the external layer is the compact bone. The internal cavity is made up of the spongy bone. Based on its shapes, bones come in various shapes and sizes. So for example here, we have first the long bones. Think of your arm and leg bones. Here, for example, is the humerus, which is the arm bone. So that is an example of a long bone. So they are longer than they are wide. So those come under long bones. So your arm bones, your leg bones, the tibia, the fibula, the femur, your humerus, radius, ulna, those are all examples of long bones. Short bones are wider than they are longer. So for example, your carpal bones and your tarsal bones, so wrist bones, are examples of short bones. Flat bones are plate-like. So for example, your chest plate, the sternum, that is an example of flat bones. Irregular bones. An irregular bone is a bone that does not have a particular shape to it. So it does not fit any other shape category. So an example of this is your vertebrae. Your vertebrae do not fit into any other shape category, and hence are called irregular bones. The next category of bone is a sesamoid bone. A sesamoid bone develops within a tendon, and they develop in response to friction, and its size varies among individuals. So the more the friction, the more harder they tend to get. And an example of this is the patella, or your kneecap. Now the kneecap develops within a tendon called the patellar tendon. An example is right here, the patella bone. Now let's take a look at a long bone. So this bone is the longitudinal section of a humerus. Now let's take a look at the parts of the long bone. The first concept that we're going to take a look at is called the diaphysis. The shaft of the long bone is called the diaphysis. This region right here, the cylinder. Now this part right here, if you take a look at this, from here to here, you see that it is very densely packed, right here where I'm drawing the green lines. That is compact bone right there. So this whole region with the green bracket, that is the diaphysis, and these short green lines are made up of compact bone. Now within the diaphysis, you have a hollow in the center. Can everybody see this hollow in the center? That hollow in the center is called the medullary cavity. It's called the medullary cavity, or the lumen. Now the medullary cavity is filled with bone marrow. So that hollow right there is bone marrow. And you have a connective tissue that lines that bone marrow. So that lining is called the endoosteum. Endo refers to inside, osteum for bone. So endoosteum is the lining inside of the bone. So that's why it's referred to as the endoosteum. Now this endoosteum is made up of reticular connective tissue. Flashback to the tissues chapter. Everybody should know what reticular connective tissue is. So endoosteum is made up of reticular connective tissue, and it is made up of stem cells called osteogenic cells. Anytime you see the name of a cell that has genic in it, you gotta know that it's some kind of a stem cell. So let's recap so far. So you have a long bone here. Its shaft is called diaphysis. It's made up of compact bone with a big hollow in the center. That hollow is called the medullary cavity. It's lined with a lining called endosteum, which is made up of reticular connective tissue, and it has certain kinds of stem cells in it called osteogenic stem cells. Now, on the outside, it's covered with a lining called periosteum. So periosteum is on the outside. It's covering all of the compact bone right here. Now that is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. And it doesn't have the stem cells. It has certain kinds of cells called osteoblasts. I'm going to talk about what osteoblasts are in just a little bit. Now, nutrient foramina. Foramina are little holes in the periosteum for blood vessels, nutrient foramina. So there are little holes through which blood vessels can pass through. Now let's look at certain more terms right here. Metaphysis. Metaphysis is the junction right here. Junction on either sides of the diaphysis is called metaphysis. And epiphysis is the ends of the long bone. So you have epiphysis here and you have epiphysis here. Now take a look at these terms. Proximal versus distal. Now this humerus is an arm bone. This side of the humerus goes towards the shoulder. This is the ball of the ball and socket joint. This goes towards the elbow. So here's going to be the elbow, and here's going to be the shoulder. Hence, this is the proximal side because it goes towards the shoulder joint. This is the distal side because it goes towards the elbow joint. Hence, that makes this end the proximal end, and this the distal end of the humerus. So you have the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis of the humerus. So we just talked about the epiphysis. So we have the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis. Now inside the epiphysis, you do not have compact bone. You have spongy bone. So take a look at this. That is spongy bone right here. So you have, this is compact bone, where you see the red dots. All of that is spongy bone. Now this area right here, the blue area right here, that is called the articular cartilage. Now the articular cartilage, anytime you see the term articular, articulation, that means that that area is going to participate in some kind of a joint. Now where you have joint, there is going to be friction. Now where there's going to be friction, there has to be some way to reduce friction. Enter hyaline cartilage. Now this articular cartilage is nothing but a thick pad of hyaline cartilage, which is going to reduce the friction in that joint. So that is what is articular cartilage. So to recap here, this long shaft is called diaphysis. You have the medullary cavity right here. This is compact bone. This is spongy bone. This is endosteum. This is periosteum. This is articular cartilage. This is metaphysis. This is proximal epiphysis. This is distal epiphysis. Now, there's this line right here. Now, this line right here, at each metaphysis, it's present both at the proximal and the distal metaphysis. That is called the epiphyseal line, aka the growth plate. Now, the epiphyseal line is extremely necessary in order for a person's height to increase. So when a growth spurt occurs, the epiphyseal line is what is initiating bone growth. We're going to talk about this a little bit later during the chapter. So here it is, the epiphyseal plate. The hyaline cartilage is what facilitates the lengthening of the long growth, or elongating of long bones. Now in adults, so once growth spurts are completed and the person has reached their full height, this epiphyseal growth plate, the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage, kind of depletes and remains as an epiphyseal line. Now let's talk, we've been talking about the osteogenic cells, we've been talking about osteocytes. Let's go over the different cells. So first, let's look at the cells of the endoosteum. We've talked about the osteogenic stem cells. They are found in the endoosteum You can also see them scattered around in the periosteum. Now they are stem cells. Now once they get the signal to mature, they are going to mature into something called the osteoblast. Here you have a nice scanning electron micrograph of an osteoblast. Now what the osteoblast does, an osteoblast is a collagen secreting cell. So an osteoblast is going to secrete collagen. Here you can see it's secreting collagen. So collagen is secreted and it attracts calcium ions and turns into an osteocyte, which is nothing but a mature bone cell. So osteogenic stem cell turns into osteoblast, which secretes collagen, turns into osteocyte, which attracts calcium ions and becomes a mature bone cell. So you can see scanning electron micrographs here of both an osteoblast and an osteocyte. Now osteocytes are housed within this hard ground substance, hard calcified ground substance, and one osteocyte communicates with another osteocyte with holes in the ground substance called canaliculi. So canaliculi are tiny canals within the hard calcified ground substance that facilitate communication between different osteocytes. The next type of cells present in osseous tissue are called osteoclasts. They are a type of macrophage, and they develop within the bone marrow, and it requires the fusion of about 3 to 50 stem cells. And they're a type of macrophage, like I said. Now, their characteristic appearance is a ruffled border. And here's a scanning electron micrograph, and you can clearly see the ruffled border right here. And that ruffled border is because of large microvilli. And they help reabsorption. So anytime there is a need to reabsorb bone, so bone needs to break down, these are the cells that are helping the old bone to break down. They usually reside in the endoosteum and the periosteum within little pits, and anytime there needs to be more calcium within the bloodstream, which means that bone has to break down, the osteoclasts are coming into the picture to do their job. So they're chipping away at bone and circulating that calcium within your bloodstream. So let's take a look at the larger picture of the bone histology right here. So a structural unit of compact bone is called the osteon. So this little unit here is the osteon, right here. Now the osteon consists of a central canal through which you have blood vessels running. So that's the vasculature right here. You have collagen fibers. You have lacunae, which are spaces between, or the air pockets in which the osteocytes are housed. So this is the space or the air pocket in which the osteocytes are housed. That is the lacuna or lacunae. This right here is the osteocytes. Now this little canal through which one osteocyte is going to connect to another osteocyte is the canaliculi. And the concentric circle, so this is a concentric circle, this is a concentric circle, so a circle within a circle within a circle, those are called concentric circles. The concentric circles in which the matrix is layered is called lamellae. So that is an osteon, or a structural unit of a compact bone. In addition to this, there is a rich supply of blood vessels, as well as a rich supply of nerve endings, which makes the bone tissue very sensitive to tearing or tension of any kind. Now, spongy bone, we have small little spines. So spongy bone is a lot more porous or perforated in terms of density compared to compact bone. And that is because of little spiny processes called trabeculae. They're thin plates of bone, or thin spines, if you will. And those pores are filled with red bone marrow. So these are spaces where hematopoiesis is taking place. Now, these spongy bone lacks the osteon. So there's no central canal, there's no lacunae with osteocytes in spongy bone. Now, in spongy bone, the interior of long bones is mostly made up of spongy bone. One, to decrease weight. However, these bones tend to develop what are called stress lines in order to increase the strength of these less denser bones. Now, trabeculae develop along these stress lines. So, for example, you are looking at the proximal end of a femur bone. So this is the thigh bone. What you're looking at right here is the head of the femur. So this is the part of the femur that is going to articulate or form the joint with your hip bone. Now, these lines that you see in purple and red are the stress lines where most trabeculae are going to form and increase the strength of the femur in order to avoid fractures. So over here you can clearly see the medullary cavity, which is what I'm drawing right now. You can see the compact bone right here, and you can very clearly see the spongy bone and the trabeculae right here. Now, the next concept we are going to talk about is the bone marrow. The bone marrow is usually found in the medullary cavity of long bones and among the trabeculae of spongy bones. And we have two types of bone marrow. First, we have the red bone marrow, which is a hematopoietic organ. And in children, it is found in every single bone. In adults, it is found in the vertebrae, in the proximal heads of the femur and the humerus, the vertebrae, sternum, and the pelvic girdle. The next type of bone marrow is a yellow bone marrow, and it is a triglyceride storage organ. Now, as a human being grows into an adult, the space that is occupied by red bone marrow develops into the yellow bone marrow as the immune system is developed. So, as a child, you're still developing your immune system, but an adult has a fully formed immune system. However, as an adult, when you're fighting an infection or if you're suffering from anemia, your yellow bone marrow can convert back into red bone marrow. The next concept we're going to talk about is bone development. The term for bone development is osteogenesis or ossification. Now, there are a few different times where bone development can occur. One, it can occur in utero during embryogenesis. Two, it can occur during growth spurts. Three, bone remodeling occurs as a normal part of life. And four, it can occur after fractures. And there are two mechanisms for initial bone formation as an embryo. One is called the intramembranous ossification process that converts spongy bone to form compact bone. And it usually happens for flat bones. The second process is called endochondral ossification, and it is a process by which cartilage is replaced by bone. So first, let us talk about intramembranous ossification. Intramembranous ossification is a simpler method, and it takes place in 4 steps. So let's talk about step number 1. Now, in the connective tissues chapter, we talked about the embryonic connective tissues. Embryonic connective tissues, there are 2 types of embryonic connective tissues. The most common one is called mesenchyme. Now, in step 1, there is a rough ossification center that develops. The mesenchyme cells come together and differentiate into a rough osteogenic stem cells, which differentiate into osteoblasts. Over here, you can see a rough ossification center that has formed. So mesenchyme cells that have clustered together right here, and osteoblasts have come together. So you can see these osteoblasts. The osteoblasts come together. Now remember, osteoblasts are collagen secreting cells. So they secrete an organic matrix. They start to secrete an organic matrix. Now as they start to secrete the organic matrix, they enclose themselves and start to absorb calcium right here. Now as the calcium hardens, you can see the canaliculi start to form. So here's a canaliculus, here's a canaliculus. Canaliculi start to form, and this round substance here starts to harden. In the 3rd step, trabeculae start to form, and vasculature starts to form within the trabeculae. You can see these are all trabeculae right here. So trabeculae start to form and vasculature start to form within the trabeculae. In the 4th step, the periosteum starts to form around the newly formed bone. Now in the last step, the spongy bone continues to condense. So you have this rough spongy bone right here. Now this spongy bone continues to condense to form a compact bone. Now let's move on to the more complex procedure, which is the endochondral ossification. Now this is the method by which long bones form. Now remember, in long bones, you have to have the diaphyses, the metaphyses, the proximal, the distal epiphysis, along with the growth plate. So this is when cartilage is replaced with the bone. So this is a more complex way of forming bone, and it involves 6 stages. So let's start with the first stage. In the first stage, you have development of the cartilage model. So in the first stage, the mesenchymal cells crowd together and form the general shape of a long bone. So you see that the mesenchymal cells have come together and formed the general shape of a long bone. Now they form hyaline cartilage, and it starts to kind of look like a bone. Now this cartilage is covered with perichondrium. Note that this is not periosteum, it's perichondrium, because it is still hyaline cartilage. It's not yet bone. So this is where the future proximal epiphysis is going to be, this is where the future diaphysis is going to be, and this is where the distal epiphysis is going to be. Now this is still perichondrium and chondroblasts because this is still hyaline cartilage. In the second stage, it is growth of the cartilage model. So the chondrocytes, which are the cells of the hyaline cartilage, are starting to proliferate, divide by mitosis, and divide. The central chondrocytes are starting to undergo hypertrophy. Everyone should be familiar with what hypertrophy means, starting to enlarge and begin to die. Now, what happens when they begin to die or undergo apoptosis? Now, this means that there is a rudimentary medullary cavity that is starting to form. So this preliminary bone is starting to elongate, and the medullary cavity is starting to form. In the next stage, the osteoblasts in the perichondrium are starting to form bone and the periosteum. So here's where the periosteum is starting to come into the picture. So development of the primary ossification center. So ossification center is coming into the picture here. So you have a nutrient artery that is starting to form, the medullary cavity is starting to form, ossification spreads towards the end, the bone is elongating, so development is taking place. In stage 4, as the ossification center is traveling towards the metaphysis, the medullary cavity is also growing. So you can see a nicely formed medullary cavity right here. Something else is starting to happen. What needs to come over here? An epiphyseal growth plate needs to happen right here. Now, osteoclast breaks down. So this is where it is going to stop. Now, development of secondary, so this is where uncalcified extracellular matrix is going to remain. This is where stuff needs to stop and something else needs to form over here. This needs to remain untouched because you want hyaline cartilage to remain over here as part of the growth plate. Now, this is where development of secondary ossification center needs to happen. So development of secondary ossification center happens right here. So spongy bone remains right here. Formation of articular cartilage and epiphyseal growth plate happens last. So hyaline cartilage remains as it is right here as the epiphyseal growth plate. Articular cartilage is formed at the ends. Medullary cavity has taken place right here. Here's where spongy bone has formed. And that is your long bone completely formed. Now, bone growth and remodeling. Now, as a person grows, bones not only have to increase in length from the epiphyseal plate, but they also have to increase in width. Now, that is called appositional growth. Now, bones also have to react to changing stress. That is called bone remodeling. So let's take a look at bone growth and bone remodeling. Now, when a child undergoes growth spurts, bone has to elongate as well as increase in width. So first, let's look at bone elongation. Now, that happens via the epiphyseal plate. Now, the epiphyseal plate is found either on one or both ends of long bones, and that is the plate of hyaline cartilage. And this hyaline cartilage has a layer of mitotically active chondrocytes that increase a person's height. Now, the chondrocytes in the hyaline cartilage undergo both hypertrophy, which is increase in cell size, as well as hyperplasia, which is increase in cell number. So as cells undergo mitosis as well as increase in size, they are tugging or pulling at the diaphyses. So as they're pulling at the diaphyses, there's a signal that goes to the osteogenic stem cells to produce more osteoblasts. As there's more producing osteoblasts, there's more ground substance being secreted. As more ground substance is being secreted, there's more bone being made. Now, this is being facilitated by growth of cartilage as well. So growth of cartilage is being facilitated by growth hormones. Now this process takes place until a person continues to secrete growth hormones and until no cartilage remains. So this usually happens by the age of 18 to 21, sometimes up to the age of 25. Now when we talk about growth hormones and growth spurts, we also have to talk about something called Achondroplastic Dwarfism. Now Achondroplastic Dwarfism is a genetic condition due to a spontaneous mutation, and there's multiple mechanisms for that. Now this is a condition that only affects long bones, and this is because of a mutation that affects the epiphyseal cartilage of the long bones, where long bones stop growing in the childhood. It does not affect any other type of bones except the long bones. And you can see in this picture where a person's torso continues to grow normally. It's only the long bones that stop growing. The next concept that we're going to look at is bone widening and thickening, called appositional growth, or increase in bone width. Now this occurs when osteoblasts in the periosteum increase in number and lay down the matrix. So more matrix is put towards the outside layers and in the periosteum on the outer surface. So more layers being put on the outer surface causes widening of the bone. Now you don't want the bone to just be wide on the outside. You want the medullary cavity to increase in width as well. So the osteoclasts, or the macrophages, the eater cells, are dissolving bone on the insides, causing the medullary cavity to increase in width. Bones are remodeled throughout a person's lifespan. The rate of absorption has to equal out the rate of deposition. So on an average, yearly, about 4% of compact bone and 20% of spongy bone is remodeled. The distal portion, or the portion towards the knee, is replaced every 4 months because it's subjected to that much mechanical stress. Now the cells that remove, remember, the cells that remove or eat up old bone are called osteoclasts. The cells that put down or build bone are called osteoblasts. Now when this balance goes out of whack, this results in disease. Another example of bone remodeling is dental braces. Now these braces, when you have the wire is doing nothing but tugging or pulling and putting stress on one side of the teeth. Now, when the teeth are tugged upon, this stimulates the osteoclasts to remove bone. When there's stimulation of the osteoclasts, it's stimulating the osteoblasts to make new bone. Now, when you have more removal, but not as much new bone, what do you think happens? Your bones become more brittle and you become more prone to fractures. Now that's called Paget's disease. Several factors affect bone growth and remodeling. Now these factors include hormones, minerals, and vitamins. Now minerals include large amounts of calcium and phosphorus, and smaller amounts of magnesium, fluoride, and manganese. We're going to talk in the next lecture about vitamins, including vitamins A, C, D, K, and B12. When we talk about hormones, sex hormones such as estrogen and testosterone, growth hormones, thyroid hormones, and insulin also play a role in osteoblasts and osteoclast activity as well, and in prevention of osteoporosis. So we're going to talk more about that in part 2 of this lecture. Exercise plays a big role in bone tissue, and mechanical stress makes bones stronger and increases production of collagen. Unstressed bones actually become weaker, and this is the reason why astronauts in space suffer rapid bone loss and bone density. So we're going to talk more about how vitamins and minerals play a role in bone tissue, and a little bit more about bone physiology in part 2 of this lecture.